All right, so we're gonna start just by looking at a very simple HTML page, which has an index.html and it has a styles sheet. So how does the HTML document know about this style sheet?
The link tag.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a link tag here in the head pointing to the style sheet. So the index.html contains HTML, and we have basically just a bunch of divs and an H1. All of these divs have classes. So what's a class?
A means of grouping related items.
Yeah, exactly. So it's basically just a label that you can use to refer to a group of items later. What about an ID?
A more specific means of grouping related items.
Yeah, so and basically it can do the same thing that class does, but the kind of, again, the semantic content of ID means there should only be one. So if you have a particular element and you give it an ID, that ID should only apply to a single element. That's not enforced. That's not enforced by the browser or anything like that. Okay, and so we'll go ahead and take a look at what this looks like inside of a browser. So I'm just going to use this live server, and this is it. So I'm using grid. If we look at the styles.css, so I have a container. I'm using a container div, which is this outer div, which I'm calling container, conveniently enough. And I'm setting the display to grid, and then I'm saying how many columns and rows I want to have. I want this grid to have. And then this items class, which includes these 25 divs. There's not much going on here, but these are all these items, because they're direct children of this div container class. They will adhere to this. They'll basically implement whatever rules you set up here. And then what is this thing right here? Dot items : hover.
It's a pseudo class that is triggered once you hover on that item, any element with that items class.
Yeah. So first off, this section of CSS will apply to this class. So dot items, because it's a class. If it were an ID, if I made, let's say, this outer one, because there's only a single one, maybe I want to make it an ID. Change this, and then what do I have to change in my CSS file to make this work as an ID?
Aren't IDs prefaced with like the pound sign rather than a period?
Yes, exactly. So you would just change this from that to that, and it should work the same. So whether something's, a class or an ID is kind of, maybe you have lots of containers like this, and so you want to make it a class, or if you think maybe there's only going to be one, then you might want to make it an ID. Not really a hard and fast rule there. Okay, but if you want to refer to something, so hashtag is for IDs, dot is for classes, and then if I just want to, let's say I want to style this H1. How do I refer to the H1?
Would you just put H1?
Yeah, exactly. So if you are referring to a tag, you can just do that. So font, I'll change the font family. And so now the font is different, but only the H1 fonts. So these other fonts are not affected. What if I wanted to change all of the fonts on my web page? Not just H1.
Would you put a star? Is it a star H1 or? Oh,
Then
all the fonts. Is it a, I don't know. Is it a star something?
Actually, I'm not sure. There might be something like that. Let me just see. I don't think this will work, but
Oh, I don't know.
I'm intrigued. Ah, it did work. Okay, then. So I think this will, this probably refers to every element. So if we didn't want to use this, but we want everything. So if you look at the structure of our HTML, so where's kind of like the, what do you call it? The head node for everything that we see.
Body.
Yeah. So body. So another thing you could do here is body. And that way everything, unless we so now everything will be that font. Everything in the body will be that font. But what if we do change this to, I don't know, something obvious? Georgia, is there like a handwriting one? So what font is, well, what fonts are going to show up now?
For the H1, George is going to show up for the H1s because it's closer to the element than body is.
Yeah. Yeah. So this, let's take a look. We'll inspect it. The elements. Font family, courier new, and then let me see. Should be. Let's try this.
I think it needs the semicolon at the end of it.
Yeah, so the H1, sorry, I was looking for the wrong element. So my my H1, so I've overridden my H1 element. We can see that this is crossed out, font family. And where is that? Font family is Times New Roman here. Times New Roman here, and inspect. You can see that it's Courier New on all of these. So we've kind of, we said, hey, everything, you're going to be Courier New. And then we kind of say, oh, everything except H1. But everything kind of around that is still going to remain the same. So this, even though we've overridden it for the H1, it doesn't affect anything else. Okay, and then this hover, right? So this hover, this is a CSS pseudo class. And basically anytime we hover over it, this is going to start applying. So if we hover off it, it stops applying. If we hover over it, it starts applying. So, you know, the background color changes, and then we add this animation. So in order to make an animation, it's, you know, it's not too difficult. Just add this at keyframes. You have to give it a name. And then there are a few different things you can do here, but this is just something I copy pasted, as you'll probably do with a lot of CSS. But there are a lot of other things you can do. Are there any questions about that? Okay, so what I'd like to do now is to basically do the same thing, but with essentially like a blank HTML document. So let me. It's a little bit of an overstatement. There's still going to be some HTML. And then we're also going to add an app.js file. So I'm going to start with the boilerplate. So you can just do an exclamation mark. You'll kind of get like all of the boilerplate taken care of. So let's do all right, so in this other index.html, we had to, this very tedious process of going through and writing all of these things. So the first thing I want to do is, we want to add an H1 tag. We're going to add an H1 tag that says it's a welcome page. So the first question is, how would we even get started? Well, we'll need an app.js, and I'm just going to console log. It loaded. So if I now run this, nothing happened, but I can see that this. So let's see if I check the console. Nothing got logged. So why didn't anything get logged?
You need a link tag?
Yeah, exactly. So we have to tell, just like with the CSS, we have to tell our HTML file that we're using a script, an external script. And so there again, just like with CSS, you can embed a script tag inside your HTML. That's not recommended. The recommended way, just like with CSS, is to have a separate file. So we'll have a separate file. So you need to have a script tag. And your script tag is going to have a source. This is just going to be where it is. So app.js. And that's all you really need to do. So there's a question of, where do you put this script tag? So we could put it up here, for example. And if we reload this, you see it loaded. So that worked. We can put it in the body. And that also works. So it seems like it can work in a couple different places. So there are some reasons why you might want to do one or the other, but basically, I'd say the default thing that you want to do is you put the script tag in the head and you add this defer keyword. So we'll talk about events in a minute here, but basically what happens is when you're your HTML gets loaded, if you have a script tag up here in the head, the browser will stop what it's doing. It'll stop parsing your HTML document and then go download the JavaScript file and then execute the JavaScript file and then finish executing your HTML. So that is not very efficient. So I mean that can lead to more waiting. So that's usually not done. So the kind of an earlier a way around this was to put the script tag at the very last thing in the body. So all the other HTML gets loaded. Then when it hits the script tag, it can go download it, but other stuff is already there. This way, there's also another keyword, async, but defer will basically allow this script to be downloaded asynchronously. So your browser can handle the HTML and it will load all the HTML, and then in parallel, it'll download the app whatever your JavaScript file is, and then it won't execute it until the HTML is loaded into the DOM. So you don't need to worry too much about that, but just do something like this as a default, unless you have a good reason not to. Okay, so now we have our index.html and we have our app.js, and it's loaded. So the first thing we wanted to do was add an H1 element. Does anyone have any idea how we could do that with JavaScript? If you don't, it's fine. We haven't.
You have to access the DOM.
Okay. Yes, we do. We have to access the DOM. So what is? Let's maybe play around with the console. So the console is going to give you access to a whole bunch of stuff, which is not necessarily a part of JavaScript, strictly speaking. One of these things is window. So this is kind of like the root of any JavaScript application running in the browser. So you have this window object, and it's got a whole bunch of stuff on it. Just, I don't know what half of the stuff is. So alert is one thing. So here's the window.alert. So you can think of window as a giant object. So alert is a what? What kind of thing is alert?
It's a pop-up
Function.
box.
Is it a method?
Yeah, yes, exactly. So it is a method or a function. I think method is the better choice, but it's a method, and what it does, yeah, it's a pop-up box. So let's call window dot alert. We'll pass in. So you can actually call that method, which belongs to the window object. There's another property of the window object, which is document. And document is basically what we care about. So here's the document. It should look vaguely familiar. We have so we have the title here. So this is window.document. So if we want to do stuff to our document, then here's going to be our starting point. So you don't need to include window because you're already like in the window. So you can just do stuff like let's do console document. Let's just try that. And we reload it, and here we have the document. Okay, so document, the document gives you access to a whole bunch of other stuff as well. So we can do things like let's do So let me say that when we're doing stuff with the DOM, there's basically going to be a three-part cycle. You're going to want to grab something, you're going to want to create something, and then you're going to want to attach something. So that's basically what we're going to want to do, and we'll see that in action in a second. So if we want to add a new tag, let's say we want to add a new tag to our HTML document, you need to create the tag. We need to basically find somewhere on the HTML document where we want to attach it, and then actually attach it. So let's go ahead and find. So if we want to add, we don't have anything here. So but we want to add an H1 tag. So what would the parent node of an H1 tag be here?
It would be body.
Yeah. So let's start by grabbing body. So let body equal document, and then there are a whole bunch of very similar methods for selecting an element or grabbing an element. I'm going to use query selector, the most general purpose. So there's get element by ID, get element by class name, whatever. There's all kinds of things, but use query selector, and then you can pass it just like with a CSS selector. You can give it just the name of like a node, or a tag. You can also give it a class or an ID. So in this case, we'll pass in body. So a quick note, query selector will grab the first instance of whatever it finds. So if you have, in this case, there would only be one, but if you had this were an H1 and you had 5 H1 tags, it would grab the first one. You can also do query selector all, and that will give you, if you have 5 H1 tags, you can get all of them. All right, so query selector body. So let's just console log that. And we can see it right here. Here's the body. So we've successfully grabbed that. So now that we have the body, let's go ahead and let's create a new H1 element. So we do that. So we'll use document.create element. Document.create element, and then we pass it in a string of the tag that we want. In this case, it's an H1. So let's console log that. You can see we have an H1 tag. Now, this H1 tag is just floating out in the middle of whatever JavaScript land. It's not attached to anything. It doesn't have any text or anything like that. So the first thing we should do is we want to add some text. We want to add some kind of welcome message, welcome page. So we can try let me try going in here. So like everything else, there's a whole bunch of, kind of hidden or not necessarily obvious methods and properties and so on. So so when we created this tag, this h1 tag, we get a bunch of other stuff for free. One of them is this inner text property. So we can actually change that. And if we do h1, now we can see that this h1 tag has some text in it. Now, this is still not attached to anything. It's still just kind of floating around in the JavaScript. So we're going to need to attach it, but before we do that, we'll change. So h1 dot inner text. Welcome page. All right, so I think we're almost done here. So we have the parent element. So we basically, this is where we're going to put this thing, and then we create it. We can, modify it, and now we want to attach it. We want to attach our h1 to the body. So you can do that. You can do body dot append child, and then we just pass it in h1. If we save that, then all of a sudden on our page, we get this h1 element. Are there any questions?
Yes. What happens if like H1 has a class or an ID assigned to it or other attributes? Do you just put that in the you just put that like right in the create element, or do you have
Yeah, you
another
could do it.
special?
I mean, you could do it here. So h1 dot class name. So the name will be a little different. It's not just class, it's class name in camel case. We could do so now if we inspect the elements, you can see that it has this class of my class. So we're not doing anything with that class right now, but we could. So if we had, let's say, a separate CSS file with this my class already defined, then this would take on those characteristics. Okay.
Is it similar for ID?
Yeah, it should be the same. So h1 dot ID. Okay. All right. So that's kind of the basic idea how you do this. You find out basically the parent node of wherever you want to put this thing, then you create it, you can modify it, and then you attach it. So what we wanted to do was something like this. So I guess we can keep the h1, but we want to create this div, and then we want to create 25 other smaller divs here. So we could just create a div and then copy and paste this, 25 times or however many we're going to do that. But obviously that's a bad idea, so we're not going to do that. We will do something else. So I'm gonna wrap this in a function first off. So we'll call this we'll just paste this in. Okay, so we'll create the h1, and let's have another function. Create what should this be? Create container. And then at the bottom, basically as a runner, I'm going to do window so I'm just going to run create h1 and then create container. So this onload, again, this is we'll talk about events in a second, but this is basically going to wait until everything, all the HTML is fully loaded and ready to go. And once it is, then this script will execute. All right. So when this runs, we'll get this and then create a container. So how can we create this container div? We need to create this.
It will be in the body, so we need to define body again, since it's going to be in a different function.
Okay, sure, you do that. So document dot query selector, and we'll look for body. Okay, so you know where we're going to attach it, and we know that we want to create a div.
No, I forgot all the JavaScript you taught me, but
That's
I'm
fine.
gonna assume it's you're gonna create the div, the big div, then you're gonna create the second div and put it inside a loop. So you just set a number of a range and it's gonna create that many.
Yeah. So actually, we'll get to the inner one in a second, but right now all we're doing is, so this is not necessarily the most sensible way to organize this code, but just for the sake of what we're doing right now, so we have a function that will just create the h1 tag, and we're gonna have another function that's gonna create just this single outer div container, and then after that we'll have another function that will do all of the other inner elements. But if we just want to create this outer div,
So it'd be that like let div equal document. I guess you can pick a different name, but create element and then div. So you better pick a different name probably.
that's fine. Yeah, that'll work because div is a string. We pass it in here.
Okay. And then from then, because we created it, now we have to define it and then attach it.
Yeah. So now we have a div, but it's just it's just a generic div. It doesn't really have any specific characteristics. So the characteristics. So here it has an ID, but let's try to do this without having a separate CSS file. So we're basically going to do this inline. So here are the CSS properties that our div needs to have. Let me do this. So this div needs to have these 3 CSS properties. Just like we did above here, we create the element and then we can modify it. So div.style. So div.style, this is basically like your CSS. So div.style.display. We're going to set that equal to grid. We'll do the same thing, div.style.grid template. Notice that things that in regular CSS are all lowercase or dashes or whatever, in in JavaScript are camel case. So I'll do I'm sure I need to do that, but And then here we'll do basically the same thing, except it will be rows. All right, so I have the body, I have the div, now I'm modifying the div. So it should have all these CSS properties that I need it to have. And then once my div is ready to go,
Then you have to do the body append child. Div.
So So you have this div here. Let's see. Let me see. Yeah, that wouldn't be defined. So yeah, so I'm not, let me check. I'm not sure why this is not showing up. Maybe this is causing a problem. Yeah, there we go. So I guess it doesn't like the colons there. So here is the div element. So it's as though we wrote inline CSS. So display is a grid template columns, repeat, and so on. Okay, so now our div is there, our container div. It doesn't really look like anything because nothing's inside of it. So we need to write yet another function. And let's do create items. And I'm going to call okay. So let's go back over here. So we want to create 25 of these things. Jared, can you get me started here? So the first thing we need to do is we have to find basically the parent node where we want to end up placing all of these divs. So what's the parent node of all of these?
The div ID.
Yeah, it's this one. So we don't have, in our case, it's not called ID, but it's, so how would we access the equivalent of this?
So let div equal.
Okay, we'll call it parent div, just sake of clarity.
And document dot query selector. And then whatever it was called.
So in our case, we didn't give it a class name or an ID, which maybe is a little dangerous, but if we only have, if this is going to be our first div, then this should work. Again, this may not be a good idea in terms of, you know, down the road, this might cause a problem, but for now, we'll go with this.
Well, then maybe we should real quick give it an ID. Doesn't
We
seem
could.
like it would take very long.
Could, precious seconds though. This is what happens in the real world too. Yes, we could make things better, but it will take longer. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's make let's add div, and then we'll do equals parent. That way we can so let's go ahead and parent div. So now we have a more robust application. Okay, so we have the parent div.
I have a question.
Yeah.
With and you're probably going to cover it later. If that's fine, just tell me to wait. But with the query selector, it selects the first one. Are we going to go over how to select it? Are we going to go over how to select the second, third, and fourth, or do you got to make it unique names like this?
No, I mean you can do query selector all. There are things like, you know, last child and first child. There's a whole bunch of other methods that you can use if you need to target a particular. If we need to target, like, you know, the 15th div here, there are ways to do that.
Okay.
Okay, so we have this parent div. So now we need to create 25 other divs, item divs.
Sounds like a loop.
Yeah, I think so let's just stick with a for loop when we haven't seen a good old-fashioned JavaScript for loop in a while. So for, should we all say it together? For let I equal 0. I is less than, let's say less than or equal to 25. I should start this at 1 probably. So this won't be a traditional for loop. And then I plus plus. So inside this for loop, what should we do?
Just do those 3 steps.
Okay, yeah, exactly. So let so create element. We'll create a new element, and then so we also need to play the same game where we change all the styles. So it's a little tedious, but we'll just do it anyway. So item div dot style dot background color. That will equal, very important that remain aquamarine. Border px all it is. Oops. And that is 30px, 30 pixels. And text align. Okay, so I have created a div for every single iteration here. I modify it, and then what do I need to do?
attach it
Parent
to the
div
parent.
dot append child.
Okay, so parent div dot pen child item div. And look at that. Except we are missing something. Let's take a look at our elements. So we have this div, but there's nothing, it's got no text content. So we do item div dot text content is, we'll just make that I. And then there we go. So our
What's the difference between text content and inner text?
inner HTML
Or
or
the one, yeah, inner
oh,
text,
inner
yeah.
text. I'm not actually 100% sure. No. So there's some. So I'll say one that there's a difference between inner text and inner HTML, even though in our case that wouldn't make any difference. It could potentially make a difference. So the way that the HTML, the DOM, it's basically like a tree of nodes, and every node, so you have a div element. So a div node is not just one node. It actually can have other nodes, including a text node. So if, in a kind of older style of navigating through an HTML document or the DOM, you'd actually have to go visit a node like a div node and then visit that text node and then change things. So so that's a general note. I'm not 100% sure text content and inner text. I'll check that out over the break.
I think using one over the other is like a security risk. So like one is preferred over the other because of that. I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, I'll look that up over the break. But if anyone else knows, feel free. Okay, so we have a whole bunch of these. So I guess notice our HTML is still basically just blank, but now we have a page. So you probably have maybe 15 or 20. You guys want to take a quick break, then come back and finish up? Or do you want to power through for 15 or 20 more minutes?
Break.
Break? All right, break it is. Okay, so we've seen, let me share my screen. So we've seen how, oh, by the way, I think text content seems like it's what we want. I pasted a link there. So there are a lot of similarities and some differences, and you can read up, but probably the best default would be to use text content. So here we basically, made a web page just using JavaScript. We can make this. So this is, not, once it's loaded, it's not gonna be changing. We can make this a little bit more interactive by using events. So there's a whole bunch of events that we can tap into in the browser, and in response to those events, we can make changes or do things. So let's say that we want to, we can add a pop-up. So if you've ever been to, increasingly websites still do this, but you go to leave and then you get a pop-up saying whatever, please don't leave. We can do something like that. So the way this works is you first have to grab, I guess let's go ahead and we'll create a function just for the sake of it. So function, let's do, so the first thing we want to do is we want to grab whatever element we want, which in this case, I think will be our, like the entire body. Yeah, we'll start with that. So body equals document.query selector body. Okay, so we have a body, and then what we want to do here is add an event listener. So we'll do body.add event listener. And add event listener will take two parameters. The first one will be the event that you want to listen for, and they'll be passed in as a string. And the second argument will be a callback function, which is whatever you want to run when the event occurs. So in this case, let's do mouse leave. A whole bunch of other events you can choose from, but we'll do mouse leave, and then we'll give it a callback function. It will take the event as a parameter, and we'll just throw an alert. So window, please go. And we'll add this function to our list here. Okay, so now we're here and we leave the page. We get this as of it. I want to go back. Oh, no. So now I'm kind of like stuck here basically. Anytime I leave, so you could be more careful about how we're replacing this, but that's how an event listener works. So you grab an element. In this case, it was the body. Then you call this add event listener method. You pass it the name of the event, and there are all kinds of events. You can look up lists of them. And then you give it a callback, which is what you want to run when the event occurs. Okay, so I'm gonna so we could let's say if we want to make these deletable, these boxes. So if we click on a box, the box will delete. So we would handle behavior like that using an event listener. So the first thing we'll do is, in this case, I mean, we could attach an event listener to every single one of these boxes, but I think it would be better to attach it just to the parent, and then we can check that. So let's delete box. So let's grab that container div. Query selector. And we gave that an ID, right? Parent. Okay, so we have the container, and now we need to attach an event. So we want to attach a click event. So container.add event listener, add event listener, click, and then the callback function, the event. So we could do something like so initially maybe you could do something like this, where we have we're adding an event, a click event. So anytime anyone clicks on this container, the background color will turn red. So that should be happening. Oh, I don't think I called the function. So if I click any, it turns red. If I click anywhere, not even on a box, but even in between, it will turn red. Okay, but we don't want that to happen. What we actually want to do is target the specific box that was clicked. So let's check out what the event. Let's check out what the event has for us. Console. So we get a whole bunch of stuff. Yeah, so with all the stuff, there's a whole bunch. What one property we have is a target, and we can see that the target is a div, and it's that div, 14 that I clicked on. So we can actually use that information. So let's do e.target. Let's see what we get here. I'll click on the fourth one, and here's the target. It's the fourth one. So we can use that information. So we are attaching an event listener to the parent, and then when we actually get a click event, we can grab the specific element that was clicked. So there are a few different ways we could handle something like this, like removing. We could use CSS to make it invisible, but we'll just remove it. So you can do something like so we'll get the, let's do container dot what is it? Remove child. I mean, there's more than one way to do this, but can we give this a whirl? So I clicked on 4, and now 4 is gone. If I click on 19, 19 is gone. Let me see. So you can click on all these kind of at random, and they'll all get deleted. So what we're doing is we're putting an event listener on this this container element, and then whenever there's a click, we examine the event that gets passed to us, which contains a whole bunch of information, including the target, like the object of the event, basically. And then in this case, we're removing it. We could do all kinds of other things, though. So that is the basics of how events work. So using JavaScript, you can create elements. You can change the CSS. You can create events and then make changes based on those events. I think that's about all I wanted to cover. Other questions about events?
Where can we get a list of events, like, or what would we Google to find a list of events?
Yeah, I'll try to find something good. I'm sure that Mozilla has something, but yeah, I'll try to find a good one. I'll post that. Okay.